All right, so today we're going to be talking about how to stay on a budget in 2024 and how you can be competitive and play meta. I'm super excited about today's video. We're going to be focusing on the next format, so post Phantom Nightmare, but there's going to be a whole lot of just general tips in here that hopefully help you in any format that is to come. So yes, like the video if you enjoy it. And please let me know what your thoughts are and what your advice would be for people that want to be on a budget. So first of all, we need to kind of figure out where we're at right now. We're moving into a format that's arguably going to be tier 0. And if not that, we're going to have predominantly fire decks pretty much. Like there are going to be a couple decks that are completely going to dominate the meta and be at the forefront of the format. And these are expensive, obviously. So if you want to be on a budget, your best course of action would be to counter those decks. That's literally what you have to do if you want to win, if you want to be competitive. You need to find a way to hang in the meta with these decks and preferably win against them and, dominate them back pretty much. And you can definitely apply this in any format. You're trying to counter the meta, whether that's with a rogue deck or with a budget deck, because you either don't want to play it or you want to, not spend a ton of money like we have established. So what can you really do? You need to consider which deck to play, what cards to pick up, so you can best beat the meta. But the only way to do that is to actually figure the meta out, to play those top decks, to really know how the fire decks in our scenario, of course, play and how you can also counter them. You need to play a deck that's viable and preferably has a good fire matchup. So, the best course of action for you to figure out everything about the fire decks is to actually play them with the help of a simulator, for example, or you can just talk with your friends, like in a Discord call, go to locals, theorize, you can even make proxies, try to really figure the deck out. And at that point, you haven't spent a single dollar yet, maybe like for gas when you went to locals, but that's pretty much it. You're trying to know what the deck is doing so you can effectively beat it. And I think this is the best course of action in any format. Just go on DB and just figure out and find out what the deck you're trying to go up against is really about. Figure out its weaknesses, because you're going to be able to determine which cards to use against the deck. And with that, you're also going to be able to realize which deck is going to be the most useful. So now you know a bit of what the deck is doing, what it's trying to accomplish, how it's playing. But something to also consider is the fact that this is not going to be the only deck in the room, or those fire decks are not going to be the only decks present at an event. Because a lot of people are going to be thinking pretty much in the same way as you. They're going to try to play decks that are a little cheaper, so you're going to have to prepare for multiple decks. However, with fire pretty much dominating the meta, the preparation is going to be slightly easier because we're still going to be in a diverse format, but it's not going to be as insane as it's been in the last couple of months, or at least the top decks, most of them are going to be playing the same engine, if nothing else, and the extra decks look very, very similar. So how you can go about determining which decks are actually viable and kind of pinpointing the qualities of those decks and why they are performing is you can get a lot of help and inspiration from the topping deck lists of this format. And again, you can do this in any format because decks top for a reason. They do well because they have a good matchup against the meta, or because they have certain qualities which we're going to determine, of course. So what you can do is there's a lot of resources online, and it's not just deck profiles on YouTube or stuff like that. You can branch out. You can try and find out things on certain pages. There's Meta Duelist, which is a new page from Sleeve Chief, actually, and it's really amazing. It's a great resource for TCG and OCG decks and, tournament reports, deck lists. There's a lot on there, so that's a great resource. You can go check out TCG Player Infinite. They have a ton of decks and articles about the meta. which you can also read, of course, if you want. And, you know, just go on Twitter. Literally, there's Ready for Duo and YGO Pro deck where you can just literally type in, if you go on the actual website, you can type in the deck you're searching for, and it's going to like let you know what event the deck topped, how many players there were. So you can find a lot of topping deck lists, and then you're trying to actually study the format and figure out what all of them have in common. And what we're actually going to be determining for this next format is the fact that you are going to need 3 things with your deck, and it's going to be consistency, having a strong engine, and having enough space for non-engine. Basically, with the strong engine part, you're trying to combat fire, which is going to be, if you haven't looked at it, you know, by now you probably should have, it's going to be insane. There is so much consistency with the fire decks. They always have some kind of extenders, and you're going to need a really strong, consistent deck because you're gonna want to break their boards for the most part. You know, moving forward, we're going to be playing hand traps and board breakers because you're going to try to hinder your opponent and then break through their board. And they have a lot of extenders, like I said, so you're going to need, you know, all the help you can get, pretty much. And once you realize that, you're going to like try to pinpoint which decks actually have all of these aforementioned qualities. And that's where the topping lists come into play, because once you see all of them, you can see like, okay, you know, there's Dispia decks, which Dispia was never the most consistent deck, but if you play it in a certain way, you know, your deck actually does a lot. There's tier limit decks, which have a really strong engine. There's a lot of decks as well that have space for non-engine because, again, like I said, you're trying to combat those decks. And that's why you see random stuff like Invoked or Marinces or Kashtira even, or stuff like that top, because they have those qualities, or at least 1 to 2 of them. And not every single deck of those is the most accessible, because you also need to realize, if you're on a budget, not every single deck is going to be, you know, the same price. Like, you're not going to pay the same amount of money for Pearly or for Flunder, for example. But both of those decks are still much more accessible than some of the fire decks are going to be in the next format. So yeah, basically, you're also trying to figure out which cards are actually like specifically going to be useful against those top decks. And, you know, now that I mentioned Flunder, one of the most important cards is going to be Shifter. And you can pinpoint that because you did all the work, you figured out what the fire decks do, and now you know that they actually utilize the graveyard a ton. So they're going to be hindered by Shifter, which is actually a cheap card. And we love that. Again, without you realizing what the decks are actually doing, there's no way of telling which cards you're actually going to be able to use against those decks. When it comes to the actual price of the quote-unquote budget decks you're looking into, there's a couple factors to consider. So you're going to want to think about your actual playstyle, and at the end of the day, the amount of money you actually want to spend. Again, there's a difference between $150 to $200 for Pearly, or like $50 or $60 for Flunder. So it's gonna depend on the event you go to, your personal meta, because again, you're not going to be playing only against fire. And of course, you can like take all of this advice and just use it for any format, pretty much. It's applicable anywhere. And also something to consider is sometimes, and we have a great example of that, which was Joshua Schmidt winning with Runic Bistio. Sometimes, if you take a deck that you're actually really comfortable with and you've tested a lot, and it may not be the most broken deck in the room, but you know what it's doing and you can play it well, sometimes you're going to be able, or most of the time, you're going to be able to do much, much better than someone with like the top meta contender in that room, in that point in time. So yeah, you know, that's actually important. Like, just playing meta is not always going to carry you. And especially if you're on a budget, I think it's a relief to know that. All of the decks that we have mentioned so far, except maybe Kashira, because for some reason the field spell is still like $40 almost. You know, all of them are accessible. You also need to go back to the cards that we mentioned before, like stuff that you actually want to run against the top decks, because now you've figured out their weaknesses. And here I have a little, like, I guess, idea for you, a little example of all the cards that you can acquire with the cost. And again, it's not that bad. Like, Yu-Gi-Oh is a bit of an expensive hobby, but still, if you're trying to play competitively, investing into staples is one of the key things you should do. And, this is actually the next topic we're going to be discussing for a bit. I think smart investments are really key. And I'm not saying like do all of these like money moves, like think ahead and invest and, try to guess which cards are going to go up in price. You probably should be doing all of that, like if you're really into it. But if you're not, I think the minimum that you have to do is invest into staples. Like, not every single person is going to take the time to literally check out the market every single day almost and try to like pinpoint some of the cards that are going to go up in price. Like, not every single card is going to be obviously spiking. So you probably don't need to go out of your way to do that. But again, it's really useful. You can do it if you want to. But yeah, staples. It's something you have to have because you are investing in your hobby for the future. So if you're trying to acquire anything from this list over here, you're going to be able to play all of this for years to come. So at the end of the day, spending like $50 or something like that, or $60 for a lot of play sets of extremely useful cards, I don't think it's terrible, if I'm being completely honest. And I guess the next point of discussion I want to have is, let's talk about cards that you may already own. Because now that you've seen all of these budget decks and you've maybe tested them again on free simulators like DB or Edo Pro or whatever, you have decided what you want to play, and maybe you already have some cards. Because a lot of these decks, and I'm mainly looking at Branded and Marine Says, Tri-Brigade, like there's Runic, Sprite, I could go on and on. There's a lot of decks which, the cores are actually really cheap, and you may already have them from before. So you can check out what you already own and then add on top of it. And I always take Branded as an example because Quem is one of the key cards in that deck, and it was fairly cheap upon release. So you maybe pulled it or traded for it or got it once it was cheap because you already played that deck back then. It's different right now when you're trying to like, I guess, figure out if you should get Wanted for 65 or, 85 a couple months down the line. But with decks that have been out for some time, you maybe acquired something not even thinking about the possibility of the price spiking like twice or 3 times the original price. So if you've done that, great. And if you go into your bulk or something, you figure out you have a lot of Branded cards, from the structure deck maybe, but you don't have Quem and you're not feeling like you want to spend for it, you can try to find an alternative. And this is, one of the key things, just trying to figure out what you can substitute with what. And from Branded, you can move on to Branded Chimera, which is an accessible version, a little more accessible because Quem is really expensive, and it's still fine. And we mentioned Sprite and Runic. Again, you can just acquire an archetype that's not expensive, probably, and then you can check out what you already own and try to build a deck that way. So you're not always building from scratch, and just overall, adding on top of your deck is extremely important in my opinion. Like, take for example, I have a couple deck lists on here with Super Heavy Samurai, and what I really like about those is the fact that they're really similar, but one of them plays Bishios, the other one doesn't. And again, if you have these spotted, that's amazing. If you don't, you can try to find an alternative and play without it. And that's fine. If you don't have it, you don't need to get it immediately. And if you feel like getting it a little later, or, once a random reprint drops or something, you can just get that sometime later and just be chill about it, because there are ways of playing things on a budget. Sometimes there are cards that are just really important. They're just good. There's SP, Thrust, there used to be Prosperity, Talents as well. Like, some of these cards weren't always accessible, and that's just the reality of things. And at that point, I'm not sure if you can actually stay on a budget. Sometimes you gotta bite the bullet and do it, but it's gonna depend on how many events you go to, what your actual goals are, what you want to achieve, because we can talk about expensive cards, inexpensive cards, the game itself, the meta, but at the end of the day, those are the prices. So sometimes you're just going to have to make that conscious decision. And maybe that's not something all of you want to hear, but it's just the reality of things. But the point I'm trying to make is it's fine. Like, you do not need every single expensive card to win. And some of them are going to, make your chances a little greater. But still, what we're trying to do is we're just trying to survive in this meta and make it work and beat it, because it is achievable with everything I've said so far in this video. So let's move on and let's talk about, another factor when it comes to choosing your deck, which would be the ban list, actually. I know that's kind of random, and if we take this format we're going into as an example, we got a ban list at the end of December, so we're still going to be playing this format for like a good month and a half or something like that. But sometimes they actually hit some decks that you don't really expect are going to be hindered, because they also hit the top decks. So if they hit the top decks and the other decks are not, checked in some kind of way, they might become a little too dominant. So when you're choosing a deck that's able to counter the meta, you also need to think about, is there an actual possibility of this deck maybe getting hit in the future? So once you choose a deck and you set a budget for yourself, how are you actually acquiring those cards? There are ways of trading, and also maybe going to locals with a deck that may be incomplete. If you invest some of the initial funds into your deck and you go to an event, you maybe do fairly well, you're able to pull something with your entry pack or just do fairly well, or even win locals or something where you can take all of your prices and flip them for either money or just cards and trades, and upgrading your deck that way. So that's something to consider. And of course, all of the market sites we have, like TCG Player and Card Market, they're really helpful. Like, Card Market has the entire option of Shopping Wizard, which I think is really good. It has to be utilized, in my opinion. So basically, you're able to filter out what you're doing. You're either reducing price or reducing shipments, choosing a seller, their reputation, even location, I'm pretty sure, the state in which cards are going to be in, everything pretty much. And once you run that shopping wizard, what I really like to do, and I'm not certain every single person does this, but if you actually take, all of the things that shopping wizard throws out, you put it in cart without committing anything, and you play around with it a bit. You can go to the seller, check out if they have anything from the cards. Sometimes Shopping Wizard is not going to do the greatest job. And if you take an extra hour, tweak it a little bit, you might be able to actually find a better deal. You're gonna have to spend some time, you're gonna have to play around with it, but it's a really, really useful tool. And if you're actually trying to stay on a budget, every single dollar or euro that you save is going to matter. So you have to try and, make it work somehow, but it is a really, really good and useful tool, like I said. So we've talked about topping deck lists, but another way of determining which decks are actually going to be good and useful is looking at OCG. And again, we have Meta Duelist for that, which is great, but there's also Roto the King. Pretty much if you look at their meta, and they're getting sets ahead of us, of course, you can see what's happening there. And if you check out some of the decks that are actually performing, you're also able to determine why that is. And of course, they have factors like Max C and obviously a different ban list and all of that. But for the most part, formats are fairly similar. So you can take a lot of inspiration from there. You can also kind of stay ahead and check out some of the tech cards or stuff that maybe is actually inexpensive but is in the danger of spiking once the deck comes to the TCG and everyone is trying to counter it. So again, if you're really passionate about that, you can do your research beforehand, and I think that's going to be really, really helpful. So to sort of recap everything, what you're actually trying to do with staying on a budget, besides staying on a budget, is beating the meta. You have to figure out what the meta is actually doing, and by meta I mean the top decks. Obviously, your deck is still going to be meta. You're gonna try to beat it. You have to figure out what it does, which cards are useful against it, and what qualities your deck has to have when you're picking it. And then you set your initial budget. You can add on top of it. You can take a lot of lists as an example to see why they are doing well, what are they actually doing, which cards are accessible, which cards you're going to have to spend a little more money on and kind of splurge with them, but you might still be able to do well. And take a lot of inspiration from lists, OCG, overall just tournament reports, representation, what players are saying. Just be active in the community, in Facebook groups of certain decks, in Discord groups as well. And a lot of us are trying to not spend a whole ton of money, and I'm pretty sure you're gonna find people that are going to have useful advice for you. But hopefully this video helped, and I guess gave you a bit of an idea how to approach actually choosing a deck, how important staples are, and hopefully we can all save a bit of money, share some tips, and of course like the video if you enjoyed it. And yeah, let me know what you think of it in the comments. Make sure you are subbed so you don't miss a single video I post, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye.